Coming up, Brooke Simpson will present Doesn't This Look Familiar? Relying Upon Experience at Gettysburg. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Brooke Simpson. He is a foundation professor and faculty of history at the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at Arizona State University. And he's also the director for the Center of Study in Race and Democracy at Arizona State University. He is also the history advisor and visiting faculty fellow at Barrett, the Honors College. His new book, Gettysburg, 1863, and The Civil War, the Third Year Told by Those Who Lived It, a book he edited, were both released this May. They joined a host of others that he has authored, co-authored, and co-edited. He is currently working on Ulysses S. Grant, The Fruits of Victory, 1865 through 1885, the second biographical volume, and an overview of the Civil War in the East. I would like to ask you to join me in welcoming Mr. Brooke Simpson.
It's going to be a rather challenging week for all of us, and a very exciting one, too. I'd like to thank Brooke, Cindy, Mandy, and the Gettysburg Foundation and the Trust for having us here. I come here 150 years ago. Two of my ancestors arrived here on July 2nd, one a member of the 146th New York, one a member of the 23rd Pennsylvania, both wearing Zouave uniforms, so the Simpsons have always been snappy dressers. Already here was one of my wife's ancestors, maybe more. Fortunately, they were snappy dressers for the 28th North Carolina. So we had a family reunion before we had a family. And by the end of July 2 and July 3, the family had covered Little Round Top with the 146th New York, Culp's Hill with the 23rd Pennsylvania, and a young man in the 28th North Carolina charged on July 3rd. Since he's from North Carolina, we in the family do call it the Pettigrew Trimble Picket Charge, and in fact was wounded during that assault fairly near the ground once occupied by the Home Sweet Home Motel. When you study a battle and the decisions made by commanders, it's logical for you to ask, what were they thinking? Why did they do what they did? I mean, that's one good reason to visit the ground here, to see what commanders saw as best you can, to remember that they did not know what would happen next. We know what's going to happen next. We have the benefit of hindsight. Why do you do that? It didn't work. That doesn't matter. The commander in question didn't know that at the time. So why did commanders make the decisions they made? And one of the things I think is very much a matter of common sense is that people rely upon previous experience. Let's see what worked before, what didn't work before. Now, sometimes they use that experience well, and sometimes they don't. And we have plenty of cases of that from July 1st through 3rd, 1863. So we go to places on this ground, on this battlefield, and we look out. Sometimes we have amazing vistas, otherwise we're not quite sure what we see in front of us. Sometimes we used to see things in front of us that are no longer there. You used to go to Barlow's Knoll and you saw a car dealership and you wondered why the Confederates were attacking across a car dealership. They weren't here for shoes, they were here for used autos. So you go ahead and ask as you stand on that ground, what had they experienced? What had they learned from that experience? How did they apply what they had learned at that moment? And had they learned well? Did they understand what they experienced, and did they apply those lessons well? Because you're not, in fact, always supposed to apply the same experience. You don't do everything the same way, because circumstances sometimes change. And we'll see that when we talk about several examples during this battle. So it's not just experience and prior experience, but it's how you apply it, how you interpret it. And there we have some very good lessons from Gettysburg. Take, for example, on July 1st, 1863. A new division commander, Francis C. Barlow, a Harvard boy. You're about to see what a Harvard education can do for you. Again, it's his first battle as a division commander. He's ascended to that position in the aftermath of the Battle of Chancellorsville, in which his command, a division in the 11th Corps, did not perform well in the eyes of their superiors. And so he's put in charge of this unit to straighten it out, to fix it up. That's the charge he's been given by his Corps commander, Oliver Otis Howard. And so as Barlow comes through the town of Gettysburg, midday on July 1, he looks northward and he says, you know what? There's higher ground out there. And I've always been taught that a good general seeks the high ground. I want to be a good general after I went to Harvard. So I'm going to take the high ground. A knoll. After all, I want a piece of ground, this battlefield, to be named after me. And so there will be Barlow's Knoll. And everyone forget that it was named for someone else before that. That makes superficial sense. That generals are always told, take the high ground. The heights will command the battlefield. And so Barlow goes out and takes that high ground. And then if you go out to Barlow's Knoll, and you stand by the statue of General Barlow, you'll notice that he has a fixed gaze, fixed towards the northwest, fixed to the Georgia Brigade under George Doles. That's what he's paying attention to. He's seeing this and he's saying, I'm doing what a good commander does. I've positioned my men to withstand an attack from an enemy I can see. If only he had looked both ways. Because to his right, and you'll see Bayard Wilkinson's battery there, that's where the Confederates initiated their attack on the knoll that now bears his name. So here's a New Yorker, a lawyer, and we all know about New Yorkers and lawyers, and put the two together and you're in serious trouble. But Barlow thought he was doing what a good commander should do. Afterwards, after his command had been overrun and he'd been seriously wounded and become part of a reconciliation tale spun by John B. Gordon, Barlow would blame his men for their poor performance and didn't look in the mirror and blame himself. Didn't learn very much from his mistake. And so while Francis C. Barlow continues to be a photogenic individual with a nice monument, that monument does not exactly mark a high point in his military leadership, but you understand what he was thinking. He didn't know Gordon was coming. Now you could say he also didn't take due precaution about the arrival of the Confederates from Jubal Early's division. I think that's true. And there were warnings there are Confederates coming down from the north, and you'll have to spread out. And that's true. So there's some things that even as he focused on one piece of experience, he didn't focus on another. The issue of what people experience, their reference points, I think, becomes even more clear on the evening of July 1st and the morning of July 2nd, when it comes to Robert E. Lee and James Longstreet. Let's remember Lee's perspective and his experience at that time when he arrives at the battlefield. He's fresh from his magnificent triumph at Chancellorsville, in which he'd been outnumbered 2-1, and nevertheless defeated the Army of the Potomac under Ethan Rafus' second favorite general, Joseph Hooker. He can apologize for that later. He believes, and he writes this in letters, Lee believes his army is invincible if it's properly led. They can do anything. By the way, there are some Yankees who believe this as well. In May 1864, during the Battle of the Wilderness, there's a staff officer who comes up and says, I know what Lee's going to do. I know what Lee's going to do to Grant, his first battle in the Eastern Theater. And Grant turns to him and said, I am sick and tired of hearing what Robert E. Lee is going to do. Some of you think he's going to turn a double somersault and land in our flanks and our rear at the same time, which I think was an excellent description of the Battle of Chancellorsville. So Lee's confidence was such that he'd gotten in the head of some of the people wearing blue uniforms. He also had a contempt for his opponent. He did not hold the generals of the Army of the Potomac in high regard. And that, I would argue, includes George G. Meade. I know the comment afterwards that Meade will commit no blunder in my front and will take advantage of any blunder I might commit. But the behavior of Robert E. Lee on this field on July 1, July 2, and July 3 shows an utter contempt for his opposite number. And pride goeth before the fall. So as Lee comes to the field and he's thinking, what should I do next? Let's set aside for the moment that's unanticipated, the clash of July 1. Lee's not expecting it. Let's set aside for a moment. We could talk about this in the Q&A. Richard Ewell's decision not to attack Cemetery Hill in the early evening of July 1, in which Ewell exercised the discretion given to him by his commander, just not in a way his commander subsequently thought he should have exercised it. Let's set that aside. As Lee's looking at that field, and as he turns to Longstreet and says, the enemy is there and I'm going to strike him, he believes that audacity will pay off again. But he also believes the other guys aren't as good as my guys, and that includes their generals. That George Gordon Meade is a snapping turtle and just about as slow. Lee is a very confident guy and says, why don't we try what we tried before at Chancellorsville? Look at Lee's plan for July 2 and compare it to his plan for May 2, 2 months before. Take your most trusted corps commander and send him on a march through a wooded area concealed from enemy view, at least as best as you can do this, and have them attack what you believe to be an unprotected flank. It's going to take time to take that march. Stonewall Jackson's march on May 2nd took time, but you're willing to invest that time in that march in exchange for the surprise and what you hope will be a devastating assault. And if there's anybody who can conduct a devastating assault in the Army of Northern Virginia, it is James Longstreet. Just ask the men of 2nd Bull Run. And so Lee's going to do it again. Gettysburg is Chancellorsville Part 2 in Lee's mind on July 2nd. And for all the talk we have about Lee and Longstreet arguing about when Longstreet should go, in the end, Lee is fully aware of when Longstreet begins, has posed no serious objection, because he knows these marches are going to take some time, maybe not quite as long as they actually took, but nevertheless, Lee is content that this battle on the afternoon of July 2nd is going to according to plan, in part because he doesn't expect the Yankees to do anything. Talk about audacity. When Longstreet begins his march, Robert E. Lee is operating under two very interesting assumptions. That George Meade will not alter his deployment, and as you found out, Meade wouldn't have altered it willingly, and that no reinforcements were in the vicinity. That the Union Army that he could understand was in place at 9 a.m. would be the Union Army that would be in place in the same place in the afternoon. As Lafayette McLaws found out, when his guys got in position and looked up and found themselves under fire, that wasn't the case. One of the things you should do if you go to this battlefield is walk out past the Virginia Monument to what used to be a little park stop, little interpretive stop. You used to press a button. It's about Pickett's charge. And you look over and you can see the peach orchard. Robert E. Lee did not have a single staff officer keep an eye on the Union position during the entire day of July 2nd. His experience had shown that he should hold his enemy in contempt. And it cost him dearly. James Longstreet was not enamored with this plan. And one of the reasons was he was not at Chancellorsville. He had not seen the Magic Act of May 1 through 3. James Longstreet's last major battle action was Fredericksburg. And what was the lesson of Fredericksburg for James Longstreet? Find a defensive position, set up, make them come to you, blow them apart. Defensive warfare will wreak such destruction on the enemy that we just have to pick up the pieces afterwards. And so as Longstreet looks out across the field, Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge, he says, you don't want to attack that. We've done this in reverse. And they've got a bigger killing field, a bigger fire zone here than we had at Fredericksburg, where you had to emerge from the town. Lee doesn't care. Lee's seen the magic his men can do. The enemy's there, and I'm going to strike them. Longstreet's reluctance to execute Lee's orders on July 2 and July 3 are born of the experience that he has seen as a defender at Fredericksburg. It's not that Longstreet couldn't attack. Again, a Longstreet assault could be devastating. A brigade of New Yorkers knew that at 2nd Manassas. Later on, William Rosecrans would find that out at Chickamauga. Give Longstreet time, and when they do advance, they will pack a punch. And indeed, as Longstreet later remarked about the fighting on July 2nd, in areas that we all now visit, it was some of the best fighting done by his army during the entire war. Intense fighting by both sides. But Lee's experience led Lee to make decisions that didn't pay off on July 2nd. And you can also say that Lee forgot some things. If historian David Blight says part of memory is forgetting, not just what you remember, what you forget, there are some things that Robert E. Lee seemed to have forgotten that day. Did his overconfidence from previous battles affect his leadership? Might he simmer down a little bit? Did he fail to adjust to his new command structure? I keep on hearing that Stonewall Jackson isn't here. Get over it. You've had some time to deal with this. Boo-hoo! Phil Kearny isn't here either. John Reynolds spends 10 minutes on the battlefield and gets 3 statues. He's doing pretty well. I don't hear these tears coming from people. What if somebody else had been here? What if Fritz John Porter had been court-martialed? Everything would have been different. That's true, but maybe not in a way that Union advocates would be pleased with, but I'm sure Ethan will disagree with that as well. But you've got new guys and new positions, just like Barlow was a new division commander. A.P. Hill and Richard S. Ewell have not commanded corps in significant military actions. Ewell had fought at Winchester, to be sure, but these guys, these are new responsibilities. And we know that Hill wasn't up to those responsibilities for a number of reasons, but that they were all there. And they had to deal with things they'd never dealt with before. Well, one reason, of course, that the action of July 2 on the Union left developed as it did was because of the behavior of yet another New York lawyer, Daniel Edgar Sickles. Don't mess with my wife. What's Dan Sickles' most recent experience? Not his experience in Lafayette Park, but his most recent experience. It's Chancellorsville. And look what Sickles is going to take from Chancellorsville. On May 2nd, as Jackson's march commenced, Sickles actually detected motion in the Confederate position, soldiers moving away. He wasn't quite sure what they were doing. He went off, engaged some of the rear guard, and later on, I'm sure, had cause to regret that he had not moved forward even more aggressively, because he got caught the tail of Stonewall Jackson's great flank march. So he's thinking, this is what the Confederates do, flank marches. I'm going to be thinking about it this time. What happened on May 3rd? Union forces under Joe Hooker abandoned high ground at Hazel Grove, providing an ideal artillery platform for the Confederates. What's the lesson from that? Seize the artillery platform, seize the high ground, and hold it. What's the other thing you learned from Chancellorsville? Your boss might be distracted, especially if he's new to his position. But he felt Hooker wasn't really paying attention to what was going on. And after all, on May 3rd, there's a reason Hooker isn't paying attention. That's because he's suffering an Excedrin moment, concussed from shell fragments. But you have a distracted commander, new to his job, seize the high ground, get those artillery programs. And remember, the Rebs like to make these flanking marches. That's his most recent experience. It's not going to happen this time. And so when he gets word from Hiram Berdan that his sharpshooters have come across some Confederates, A.P. Hill's Confederates, as it turns out, Sickles decides to act. And what you do when you go to this battlefield, stand where Sickles started, and you look up, and even with the clearing on Munchauer's Knoll now, there's still a lot of woods. An enemy can come fairly close to you before you can open fire. So you move out, say to the Trossel Farm. Then you look up. You are surrounded by high ground. You think if anybody gets control of that ridge line, it'll be like shooting fish in a barrel. So every step Sickles takes westward induces him to take another step westward, because he's transfixed by this notion of hold the high ground. I've got to act on my own. Meade isn't paying attention to me, and Meade wasn't paying attention to what Sickles was doing. Meade was much more concerned about the action that might unfold, he thought, at Culp's Hill and the Baltimore Pike. Meade only sends two people to talk to Sickles before all hell breaks loose. One of them is his son, Captain Meade. Doesn't work real well when the general's son comes by. Sickles had two good legs then, so he could run them off. The only man whose amputated leg was later focused on by Steven Spielberg. If you haven't seen that scene in the film, look carefully. That's the most interesting part of the movie to some of us, is looking at Sickles' leg. You move to the high ground. General sends his kid. And General later on sends Henry Hunt. He says, don't you think there's good ground, Hunt? And Hunt says, well, it's good ground, except it has no relation to the rest of our line. So it's good ground, but you're going to lose it. But when Sickles comes out there, he throws a monkey wrench. He doesn't intend to throw a monkey wrench into Longstreet's assault. And he certainly had no idea, if I go out here, I'll prevent a retreat. Dan Sickles was one of the first great revisionist historians of our time. Any autobiographer knows that the autobiographer is the center of his own or her own story. If only they'd listened to me. You know, the story about Henry Kidd Douglas, I rode with Stonewall, mistitled because it's If Stonewall Had Ridden With Me. John B. Gordon, Recollections, or If Lee Had Listened to Me, We Wouldn't Have Won the War in 5 Easy Steps. Everybody is so much brighter after the fact. And that's one thing you got to keep out of your mind when you're on the battlefield. You know what happens next. They did not. You have to assess the situation according to what was in their head and what they knew. Then you can raise questions. Why didn't they find out more? Why didn't they raise these other questions? Why didn't they do these things? But you can't say, gee, he shouldn't have moved out here because he was going to get attacked by Longstreet. He didn't know that. They hadn't put the monuments out there to tell people what to do. Now, in the case of the 72nd Pennsylvania, fate decreed they probably should have their monument back where it was originally, but that's a different story. Anyone knows you had the windstorm on Tuesday night, a Zouave hit the ground at the Bloody Angle. So Sickles, like Barlow, that tunnel vision, take the higher ground. That's what I ought to do, with serious consequences. Now, for the remainder of the second day, we see people use experience, use past relationships in various ways. Gouverneur Warren coming to Little Round Top. It's important that he'd known Charles Hazlitt before when he was a brigade commander. It's important that he was in command of the brigade that Longstreet had overrun at Second Bull Run, the 5th and the 10th New York. If you go to the Warren statue, you'll notice it's not dedicated by anybody but the veterans of the 5th New York Infantry, Warren's original regiment. And he used that networking. He knew Stephen Weed. He knew Patty O'Rourke. He to get those people up there, as well as Strong Vincent and his brigade of 4 divisions, including some guy from Maine whose name will not go mentioned. On the other flank, George Sears Green, who everyone seems to overlook every once in a while, oldest brigadier in the field, he had known about the importance of field fortifications. That's one reason, if you look at the green statue, it's got the symbols, basically the engineers below. And Green had been on the attacking side, had launched a significant attack at Antietam. Green said, I've got time. And unlike many other Civil War commanders, said, let's improve this position with field fortifications. That became rather crucial later in the day. And finally, George Meade, who I understand has been the subject of a recent controversial study of Gettysburg by a fellow Philadelphian. I've always thought that the theme song of George Meade's Second Day should be Should I Stay or Should I Go? As sung by Dan Butterfield, who of course had musical talent given his interest in taps. Meade's performance is one where he doesn't have a lot of experience. He has to improvise on the fly, and I think that's important. He does rely upon people he can trust. Winfield Scott Hancock becomes his man on the scene. Hancock's really not a corps commander here. He does all kinds of things, and he does them very well. But he actually never commands the Second Corps for any substantial time here. He runs to Cemetery Hill, calms down old Howard, holds him by the one hand Howard has. Then he makes sure the 1st Minnesota is remembered forever. And then the third day, make sure that he gets wounded in a rather delicate position while he's watching the repulse of the Confederate assault. But Meade's relying on somebody he can trust. He can trust Reynolds. He can trust Hancock. And he also knows about the people he can't trust, his experience. Can't trust Abner Doubleday. Doesn't matter what you just heard about Doubleday picking out the field. Doubleday's picking out the field is of a claim alike Doubleday inventing baseball. They're both set forth by Abner Doubleday. Didn't trust him. He'd been with Doubleday at Antietam, for example. He didn't trust Dan Sickles. Probably should have paid more attention to him because he didn't trust him. He didn't trust Oliver Howard. And so he's trying to work with the people he can trust. One of the reasons you see when Meade's pursuit takes the form it does is because he doesn't have people in command positions who he trusts because of what happens at Gettysburg to his immediate subordinates, his corps commanders. And finally, on July 3rd, let's return to Robert E. Lee and the issue of experience. Well, he had recent experience. Ambrose Wright coming back from his assault on July 2nd. You can get there. The problem is staying there. And so what did Lee remember? Well, what do you do with a classic set-piece assault? Yeah, the bombardment to soften up the terrain, to break the enemy's position, followed by a mass attack focused along that line, whether you want to call it Cemetery Ridge or Cemetery Hill at that point, hard to detect from where Lee was. He's not really looking at the copse of trees. We've been told that. I get that. But the fact is they're aiming for that center of the line. They know where they're going, because if you go out to the Virginia Monument, your eyes are really drawn to that area anyway as the logical place to hit. And this time he believes the Yankees will break. They've been battered and beaten, and now they will snap in two. And the road to Washington will be open, because Robert E. Lee believed in that climactic battle, and he'd been frustrated that for all the great things his men had accomplished on the battlefield, at Second Manassas, at Fredericksburg, and at Chancellorsville, he hadn't been able to take strategic advantage of those victories. Said everyone else happy about the victory, but what did it really achieve? We just stayed where we were. And he wants to make sure that Gettysburg is a battle where the sacrifice is worth it. And he thinks that will happen if he assaults what he believes to be a badly battered, shaken Union position. Two things to note here. First of all, what do you forget if you're Robert E. Lee? Well, you seem to have forgotten a place called Malvern Hill, which is kind of odd because it's just over a year before that you had done something of a similar assault with rather devastating negative results. You've forgotten Fredericksburg, apparently. It is war, Lee is supposed to say to Fredericksburg, it is well that war is so horrible, otherwise we'd grow too fond of it. He looked pretty fond of it for a while on July 3rd. Only found out how awful it could be. I tell this to my wife all the time. When we go to the Virginia Monument, I said, that man almost got your ancestor killed. I've also pointed out when we go to Chancellorsville, I said, the 28th North Carolina is right next to the 18th North Carolina. Maybe it was a bullet from the 28th North Carolina that took Stonewall down. So we're going to say, maybe your ancestor saved the Union, just wearing the wrong uniform. The other thing that Lee forgot, and some people have recently pointed this out again, is there are fences in Pennsylvania, and some of them are harder to take down than others, especially the fence along Emmitsburg Road, which proved a major obstacle to the assault that occurred the afternoon of July 3rd. Again, the Pettigrew, Trimble, Pickett assault. The Yankees fight better at Gettysburg than they had before. Their subordinate commanders are better. In a sense, when things go wrong, the Yankees don't fold this time. And this has to be attributed in part to George Gordon Meade. Whatever else you say about George Gordon Meade, and there's some people very critical about him, he didn't fold like a cheap suit, as had so many of his predecessors. He did well enough. He might not have been the man to win the war, but he wasn't going to lose it on July 1, 2, or 3, 1863. And we talk about remembering and forgetting. There's also what doesn't happen that you might have learned from. If you've been to Chancellorsville, you do know there's a line, rarely visited, Hooker's Final Line, a rather impressive fortified position. Lee had planned to attack that position, and he was thwarted because Hooker had withdrawn the Army of the Potomac under cover of darkness the previous night. Had Lee attacked that position, he might have suffered a rather serious bloody nose because the Yankees were ready for him. As Union soldiers said after Chancellorsville, we weren't beaten, our commanders were. And so sometimes it's the lesson that you never learn because you didn't take action if you want to talk about counterfactuals and speculation, by not assaulting at the end of Chancellorsville, not assaulting that prepared position, Lee missed the opportunity to learn a valuable lesson, as costly as it might have been in terms of blood and carnage. Meade seems to have learned that lesson maybe to excess in the eyes of some about 10 days later outside Williamsport, when he deliberated on whether to attack a prepared Confederate position and decided not to. And I think in his mind, he remembered Fredericksburg, although his division did well at Fredericksburg. And he remembered what had happened on July 3rd. And in the end, it wasn't worth the risk, that the more time that Meade took to prepare, and Meade took more time to prepare, the more time the Confederates would have to prepare. Everyone would learn that lesson 11 months later at Cold Harbor. Give Robert E. Lee another 24 hours to prepare his position, and look what's happening on the morning of June 3rd, 1864. So what I want to emphasize to you here is, as you go across these fields and as you stand and look out, and as you imagine what it must have been like to have been here, not just as a common soldier or a civilian, but also as a commander, try to find out what was in those commanders' minds, in part by finding out what they had experienced, what they made of that experience, how they applied that experience, and what they may have overlooked or misinterpreted in the process. I think you give a fairer evaluation of the decisions made on this field if you put yourself in their boots, so to speak, but you only allow yourself to know what they knew and experience what they had experienced. So thank you very much, and I'll take questions from you.
We have time for some questions.
I'm curious to know what your ideas are about General Greene on Culp's Hill are, with his experience being the oldest general on the battlefield. If I may say, I'm standing next to the man who met the last veteran of the Battle of Gettysburg in 1949, Professor J. Hoare from Maine. And that's James Lurvie is the veteran. He was 16, he's 80 now. Mm-hmm. What could you tell us about General Greene?
Greene's moment of attention, if you will, his most significant contribution had been his assault at Antietam towards the Dunkard Church on September 17th, 1862, where he knew how to read terrain, and his men basically followed a swale in the land and came up to Dunkard Church under fairly protected circumstances and made a lot of progress. I think Greene's previous military career and the like said, if you get a position and you have time, improve it. And while you couldn't really dig into Culp's Hill very much because of the nature of the terrain and the rocks, etc., you could improve it by cutting down trees and rolling together boulders. Among other things, when you cut down the trees, you increase your field of fire going downwards. So I think Greene understood, I've got time to prepare, nothing's happening at this moment. You're probably not going to launch an offensive operation from this height. So let's make some good use of our time and improve this position. And no one tells him to do this. This is something on his own, even though Meade is concerned about his right flank in the morning and early afternoon of July 2nd. He doesn't really inspect that ground carefully to find out what's going on. So it's excellent subordinate initiative, and we see that time and time again among the Union commanders at Gettysburg. It's subordinate initiative which proves critical in determining the outcome of this battle.
Another question right here.
I wanted to ask a question that probably doesn't get asked very much because, when I'm jumping ahead 1 year in the Civil War, because you wrote about Grant, a military biography. we know about the differences between Grant and Meade as individuals, as military people, and but do you see, in your writing, you did extensive work on Grant. Do you see any similarities between Grant and Meade in that they were able to work together and basically achieve a victory, even though it was a bloody one? In the end, Meade is a victor along with Grant.
Look, the relationship between Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade is a rocky one. Just ask Mrs. Meade, because General Meade will write her home every time he found that he had been slighted. There's no letters from Ulysses S. Grant to Julia Grant saying that Meade, he's a jerk or something like that. Grant was actually, they were considering Grant for the command of the Army of Potomac back in August 1863. And Grant said, I'm glad someone got that dealt with, because I don't want that job because I don't know the generals over there. Here I know the generals. I know Sherman. I know McPherson. I got rid of McClernand. I know these guys. I don't know them over there. And Grant knew very few people that were with the Army of the Potomac when he came over to take total control in 1864. Grant understood that Meade knew some of these people and that he could work with them. So Grant, even though he'd gone to school with Hancock, for example, relied upon Meade's assessment of Hancock. Grant probably relied all too much in the beginning upon Meade's initially favorable assessment of Gouverneur Warren. And of course, Sedgwick is only in command a week before he's shot at Spotsylvania. Grant is asked by his staff at Spotsylvania, why don't you remove Meade? And he says, I've got to have somebody who knows these people better than I do so that I can command everyone and trust some things to Meade. There's some positive effects to this, negative effects to this. Meade protests in late May, I'm not getting enough control of the Army. Grant says, fine, I'll give you more control. The next battle's Cold Harbor. George Gordon Meade is the only Union officer to brag about his performance at Cold Harbor. And he does so in a letter to his wife. I was in command of the field all day. But Grant understood that Meade was in a testy situation, actually looked for alternative places to place Meade to try to make him happier. The challenge was to try to make Meade happy because that was a tough thing to do. It was easier to lose to Meade at Gettysburg than it was to make George Gordon Meade smile. And that was a problem. But it was a relationship, I think, where Grant appreciated what Meade brought to the table enough that he could tolerate some of the shortcomings that he and others perceived in Meade. Again, I think Meade wasn't going to win the war, but at Gettysburg he showed he sure wasn't going to lose it.
And we have another question here in the front.
Yeah, Brooks, you seem to be saying that the most recent experience trumps further experience because Longstreet did march to a flank attack at Second Manassas, and you seem to be saying his Fredericksburg experience trumps that experience. Is that accurate? Yeah,
it is accurate. That first of all, the Second Manassas advance, though, is a deliberate advance into position where Longstreet continues to say, hold back now. And time is an issue here. But I think after Fredericksburg, if you stood at the Confederate position and looked eastward across the sunken road and the stone wall, you'd say, this is what modern warfare has come to. This is a sure thing. And so, because at Second Manassas, yes, they do attack. Yes, they do overrun Warren's brigade. Something Warren's going to remember on July 2nd, 1863, and he brings the same guys up, a lot of the same people. But in the end, at Chinn Ridge, that assault runs out of gas. Sooner or later, these assaults are going to run out of gas because of terrain. But defenders just sit there, fire, let them do the hard work of attacking us and finding a killing field in front of them. So yes, in that case, I think Longstreet said, Fredericksburg teaches me better lessons than Second Manassas.
Yes, I've read a lot about Chamberlain at Little Round Top. Is that as key as the things I've been reading?
The most important thing about the professor from Maine, whose name shall not be mentioned on this podium by me today, you'll probably hear it from other people, Okay, his middle name is Lawrence. And you're not supposed to call him that according to a t-shirt. But in any case, was the stand of the 20th Maine, which had some other soldiers other than its commanding officer, was that important? Yes, but so was the attack of the 104th New York under Patrick O'Rourke. In fact, if any position was giving way, it was Strong Vincent's right flank, not Strong Vincent's left flank. When the 16th Michigan gives way, Vincent comes up, is shot while trying to rally the troops, and it's just a timely arrival in the nick of time of the 104th New York that allows Vincent's people to hold that southern ridge. Now, what would have happened had Little Round Top been taken? There are 3 regiments in Little Round Top, including one containing my ancestor, have not quite yet arrived. Those 3 fresh regiments, I think, could have had a pretty good time pushing the Confederates back off, and it's not clear what the Confederates could have done with Little Round Top, at least in the short term. But don't underestimate the issue of morale and seeing forces break. If you were fighting in the wheat field and you look back and all of a sudden Little Round Top was swarming with Confederates, you might think it's time to get out of Dodge before you're surrounded. So there are all sorts of things that could have come to someone's mind. And they come to your mind if you visit the battlefield with some imagination.
Concerning General Stewart's cavalry action on the 3rd, I'm confused as, was he directed to smash into the Federal rear, classic hammer and anvil, or was he instructed to hang back and clean up the remnants as the Federal Army disintegrated? And do you think a concerted effort of trying to smash through would have had any bearing on the battle the 3rd day?
Okay, first of all, we don't know, because the Confederates did not leave good records of the orders that were issued. Everything we have is post-war recollection. One of the things that points to me that Stewart's attack is not part of a gigantic coordinated movement is, if that's so, why would you go off in the woods and fire a cannon in different directions, say, by the way, I'm here? That would make Jeb Stuart really stupid. Stuart himself doesn't make this argument later on. This is an argument that's concocted in trying to, why is he there and what's he doing? How does it make sense? And it's not clear what Stuart is doing, and whatever it was, he didn't do it terribly well. But in terms of coordinated attack, there had been a better time to make that attack if it was supposed to be coordinated with the Great Assault. We don't have any record of that. None whatsoever. And so it's us afterwards trying to make sense of what we think ought to have happened. Now, should it have happened that way? You know, should the Red Sox have replaced Bill Buckner at first base? Should the Yankees have signed A-Rod? All right, we got all sorts of things that I can say there. But if you're going to say anything, then the blame falls squarely on the shoulders of the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee. And that's one thing we find out time and time again. Lee's practice of issuing orders leaves something to be desired. They're unclear, where the orders to Richard Ewell, which to me are very clear in terms of what Ewell decided. His orders are unclear. If you look what he thought he was going to do in the second day, that whole plan is based upon an assumption of the Union position that wasn't true at the time, let alone later on. And you can blame reconnaissance and Captain Johnson for part of that. But one staff officer would have seen that the situation had changed. It's awfully arrogant to think they're going to be in the same place 6, 7, 8 hours later. In the end, Robert E. Lee was one of the best historians of Gettysburg when he met the men coming back from Cemetery Ridge, and he said, it's my fault. It's all my fault. Now, do any of you actually think Robert E. Lee would lie to his men? So I think Robert E. Lee was telling the truth. I think he understood what the burden of command was all about. He had taken a risk. He'd taken a chance. He'd done it believing it was the best thing to do. He did it with great confidence in his men, and afterwards he said, perhaps we believed too much in our men. We asked too much of them. And I would argue in those reflective moments, Robert E. Lee is being a very honest, soul-searching individual who understands that in the end, you can pick on other people. But the buck stopped there.
Time for one more question. For those who have questions and we don't have time to answer them now, please remember that Mr. Simpson will be over at the book signing table in just a few moments.
I was wondering, Lee had been fighting in the South most of the battles, and his men were fighting for the South. The people in the North at Gettysburg were fighting for their land, and Lee might have thought that he could outfox the Northerners, but they were fighting for what they had, their land, their home, and that made a difference in the battle too.
And, you know, in a way, the question is rephrased that, you know, didn't the Yankees, weren't they fighting for their land, their home, their... some were, but then, of course, there's a guy named Wesley Culp who was on the other side and had some idea about the land around there. There are reports that Union soldiers go into Pennsylvania, especially Pennsylvania regiments. They recognize now they're fighting for home. But I think they all realized, everybody realized, we have been beaten like a rented mule by Robert E. Lee's army for about a year now, with the sole exception of Antietam. And it is time for us to do something. It's time for us to pull together. And I think key to this, again, I've just pointed out Robert E. Lee as the person you ought to point to if you're going to look at Confederate defeat. You might want to point to, among other people, George Meade. As you know, George Pickett would later say the Yankees had something to do with it. The Army of the Potomac did some of its best fighting on this field. And it did some of its best fighting not because of mistakes of certain commanders, but in overcoming those mistakes against subordinate commanders. And at key moments, people like Meade himself or Gouverneur Warren, who may be the true savior of Little Round Top. These are the guys, along with Strong Vincent and others, these are the guys, Stephen Weed, others, these are the guys we ought to remember in terms of this, because they won the battle. We're all, you know, on July 3rd, the park is going to have a walk, battlefield walk of the assault on the Union Center. Again, the Pettigrew, Trimble, picket charge. And there are people who will be able to stand at the Union position, where the 2nd Corps and elements of the 1st Corps and other units are. I'll be interested to see how many people want to stand there, and how many people want to be wannabe Confederates as opposed to be wannabe Yankees. I know where I'll be standing on July 3rd. Thank you very much.